and Bond Committee. You do have an opportunity on the city website to click on the link of what's on the agenda. We only have an hour time, but we meet every single week at the same time on Thursdays from 4 to 5. These meetings are recorded, so you can go back and watch and listen to these meetings as they happen. So with that, I'm going to start the meeting and open it up to our presentation that's being on city debt and fiscal responsibility with Rick Dater. So I'll hand it off to Rick and we'll start. Thank you guys. And thanks for everyone for joining.
Sure. Thank you, Charlie. And hi, everyone. Again, I'm Rick Tatter. Can you see my screen okay?
So, yeah.
Okay.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Great. I'm Rick Tatter, Management Service Director and City Treasurer for the City of Flagstaff. Since you were so enlightened last week, I was also asked to talk about the bigger picture of the City of Flagstaff, talk about the debt that we issue, including our general obligation bonds, and give you a concept of our fiscal responsibility. We just feel this is a good little brief presentation. It's more educational than kind of trying to get into the weeds. But we thought this may be helpful for you as you go forward and make decisions on bringing ballot measures forward. I'm going to turn off my video for streaming purposes. So first, I'm going to talk about city debt. The City of Flagstaff has many ways that we issue debt to advance needs of our government services. I'm going to go through the different types and what they're used for as a starter. Last week, you all had a good introduction to our general obligation bond debts. Again, those are required to have voter approval, and they are backed by our secondary property tax levy that we talked about. I mentioned last week we have the 2.8 left in authorized issuance for our parks land. And this gives kind of a recap. This comes from our annual financial report, which is available online. Gives you all the descriptions and information of what our debt outstanding is. And I will send the link to the financial reports for you if you're really looking into more detail than what we're presenting today. Okay. So here we have about 40 million in principal outstanding from general obligation bond debt as of June 30th, 2021. Our next type of debt is revenue bonds, which are very common in a government. We issue debt that is backed by various taxes that we assess or by fees and revenues from different parts of our organization. When we issue a revenue bond, the only one that requires voter to approve issuing a debt is if it's backed by a sales tax that was approved by voters. All other revenue-backed debt the city can issue without voter approval. Okay. Examples of some of the revenue debts include our business incubator up on the Science Mesa at USGS. Our water and wastewater use these types of debts heavily to fund their capital improvements. And our road repair and street safety, we issue debt to advance and repair roads quicker. And we have authorization to issue for more debt for our USGS campus, as well as the transportation projects that were recently approved in the voter election. Here you can see we have about 41 million. And when you look at the breakdown, governmental means your general funds, your special revenue funds, and so forth. And business activities are more of our enterprise funds, which is our water, wastewater, airport, landfill, and those. Another type of debt we issue is a certificate of participation debt. This one also does not require voter approval. But what this does is the city pledges assets of the city of Flagstaff. In return, we make lease payments back to the bondholders, and we receive cash for our projects to complete capital projects and so forth. The payment resource in this one could be various. Could be general fund, could be an enterprise fund, or so forth. Most common ones that we've used recently were for our core service facility out on Old Route 66, just west of Flagstaff. Our courthouse was built with some certificate of participation debt, which was paid back by court fees to pay back that debt. And most recently, we did a public safety bond with certificate of participation debt. That was $131 million. And that's in my presentation letter. We'll talk a little bit about that decision in a few different screens. So here's where you see a large amount of outstanding debt here.
Sure.
Most of that is that pension bond.
So, real quick, Rick, is you got to raise my hand, I guess.
Yes, go ahead.
So, okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, we can. Thank you, Al.
Okay, thank you, guys. That is a large amount of debt. When is that scheduled, or over what period of time is that scheduled to be repaid?
Most debts that we issue on a 20-year period is what we generally go for, unless we have the revenues to pay off sooner. That one is a 20-year debt.
So what effect does this size debt have on our ability to bond for the things that are going to be presented in the next month and a half?
It has zero impact. These are a different revenue source and a different pledge.
Okay, because they don't need voter approval.
Yeah.
The city. How does a citizen find out what is out there backing these debts? I mean, do we? Obviously, the city has far more than 136 million in assets, but you know, what assets are put up against this kind of thing? What do we stand to lose if we don't pay them back?
So for the core facility, it's the buildings out at the core facility.
Okay.
For the courthouse, our courthouse is pledged.
Okay.
And public safety debt is pledged by various buildings throughout the city. Not $131 million of facilities, but a much lesser amount. I think we only pledged about 40 million of our facilities. I think the Aquaplex, City Hall, maybe the library, a few facilities.
Okay. Oh, yeah, you're going to talk about the public safety pensions more later on in this presentation, right?
Yep, absolutely.
All right, then I'll back out. Thanks. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And thank you, Al. And as a reminder, maybe you could lower your hand. Perfect. Thank you.
Gotcha.
And again, I'm just educating. I was just asked to educate on other types of debt. These debts don't impact your decisions. Just want you to have an understanding of the city full picture of debt.
Thanks.
All right. The next type of debt are loans. We can do loans and receive revenues. Most commonly where we use this one is for Water Infrastructure Finance Authority bonds. They have cash that they're willing to loan to municipalities. And generally these are back through our revenues of our water services funds and commonly used for water, wastewater, and stormwater. Here we were also successful in issuing $6 million in debt to pay for our forest thinning projects through our watershed protection. They financed those and they gave $1 million of that debt. So that's another type of, we can go direct loans. We often go in to do capital leases. If we don't have the cash to pay for equipment or so forth, we may lease over time. Again, no voter authorization required here, but this is for purchase of equipment and smaller capital improvements, such as our solar projects that we have at our wastewater plants and the Aquaplex, our copier, parking kiosk, we're funded with debt, and airport hangars. Um, so when it comes to capacity of debts, and this gives you kind of a picture of what the city can do when it's related to debt capacity is based on our ability to pay back the debt. If debt could be higher if we have too much debt outstanding that has a pledged resource versus the amount of annual debt payments. And that's a balancing act that we try to do to assure the bondholders we can pay. Council and city staff can set policy limits related to debt, and we've done that quite often, especially with our secondary property tax maximums. In our water service funds, we have a policy of not more than 25% of our operating revenues. But other than that, we don't have a statutory limit other than our general obligation bonds, which this group is considering sending to voters. The rest is really managed within our capacity and what bondholders are willing to accept. So that is just a big picture of all city debt. And I'll send you a link again to the financial report that tells people what the debt issues for and what the payments are going forward. But the next piece is a conversation about fiscal responsibility. We did a similar presentation to the Housing Committee, and I was asked also to bring this forward to you as the Bond Committee to talk about our fiscal strengths of our organization.
Okay, and thank you, Rick. But before we move on, I forgot to mention, I did mention in the chat part, and I'm not sure if everybody can see that, but if anybody has any questions, you can raise your hand on your computer, or if you, in the chat, you can ask a question in the chat box too, and we'll answer any questions you may have. So thank you, Rick.
You're welcome. One of the main fiscal responsibilities of a city government is we have a budget process and certain controls in place that we're required to follow on an annual basis. Our budget process is a very lengthy process. It starts with kicking off the conversations with council in our December retreats and start building our recommendations for the following fiscal year. We go through several steps from January all the way to July. I'm not going to walk through all those steps just for a measure of time for this group, because we know we've got a lot of discussions later on public safety bond ballot measures. So, but we have check-ins with council quite often. The top row talks about, we talk in December, we have a conversation in February to get direction. We balance all the requests that are provided by all sections and all divisions of the organization. And in April, we bring a balanced budget to our council and have discussions if we hit the marks that council wants for operations the next year. And then finally in June and July is when we do the formal adoptions of our budgets. Our budgets are consistent with governmental accounting practices, and we put the responsibilities on the city manager, division heads for managing expenses as they're approved by our council. We have several policies that we use when building our budget requests and our 5-year plans and so forth. We have a policy to have a structurally balanced 5-year plan for all funds of the city. And when we're talking about structurally balanced, we confirm that we have ongoing resources that are available for our ongoing operational needs. Anything that is outside of the ongoing commitments may get a one-time funding, but we structurally balance these so we're committed to the operations side. We do assure.
Rick, I do have a question here, but I think you might answer it here shortly, but I'm going to read the question for you and see when it's appropriate to answer it, if now or here in a moment. It's from one of our committee members, Mr. Ghetto. says, how is debt repaid for non-revenue backed bonds like participation bonds?
So I'm going to go back. Each one of these, it's usually pledged by the resource that receives the cash for the capital improvement or the commitment they want to make. So for example, with the certificate of participation, the core maintenance facilities was the solid waste commitment to that facility. So the solid waste fees pay back for that debt. The courthouse has court revenues that are restricted to pay back debt. So that comes from our fines that people have. The public safety pension is different, and that's from our general fund commitment from our revenues. But generally, whenever we issue these debts, if it's for water, water is responsible for the revenues to pay back debt. If it's for road repair, the transportation taxes are responsible for those. They're aligned based on who receives the value.
All right. Thank you, Rick. I think that answered it pretty clear.
Great. Other budgetary policies, we want to assure our revenue estimates are achievable on an annual basis. We want to make sure our projections can meet future commitments. And we do reserve a portion of our revenues for one-time use versus committing 100% of our taxes on an annual basis or revenues on an annual basis, assuring we have that flexibility in out years. If we have cash balances, saying for example, in a year we don't spend all our funds, does allow us to increase our fund balance for future budget allocations. But those are more of one-time commitments when we have that underspent expenditure. And we commit those only to one-time expenditures going forward. We don't throw that into the ongoing bucket of budgetary needs. We have policies related to minimum fund balances, assuring that we do have the cash in our operations on an annual basis. Our general fund policy is a minimum of 15, but we keep a 20% goal in our general fund. So we are very conservative, and we assure we have a little bit extra set aside. Most of our 5-year plans do keep to a 20%, 10 to 25% fund balance requirement. When we're doing projections, we do build in recession cycles into our revenue projections because they do come around, average of every 7 years or so. But we want to ensure we're positioned for those decline in revenues, and we built that in projection and make sure we're not overcommitting those ongoing resources for the organization. So those are some of the policies that make it a strong position for this organization. Here kind of goes to what the question was also earlier. We also look at the color of money. We have many types of funds in our organization, and I will send you a color of money spreadsheet to the team after this meeting. Our enterprise funds, those are business type funds, and those include our water, wastewater, airport, solid waste, environmental fees. Those are expected to bring in the revenues necessary to run their operations. They run like a business type. Special revenue funds could be revenues that were approved by voters, such as our transportation taxes. It also includes our library funds, which have revenues from a secondary property tax from the county, as well as general fund contribution. Our BBB tax funds are considered a special revenue fund. Those are some examples that we have for those areas. Capital project funds. This is where we put our bond commitments, such as our general obligation bonds, into a separate capital project funds, keeping it separate from the needs of the rest of the organization. Our debt service funds, that's where we restrict our monies to pay back certain debt services, such as the secondary property tax that we are looking to get approval for. And then general fund is really that catch-all everything. And really, it is kind of an unrestricted revenues that can support the entire organization. But we do not allow revenues to transfer between, for example, a highway user fund, which is a special revenue fund, over to the general fund just to pay for public safety. They're restricted in what we can use them for, and we manage and assure that those revenues for each one of these fund types are being used specifically for those restricted uses. So we have a whole accounting structure. I think we have over 100 funds that we do to assure that your revenues and your taxpayer fees and taxes are spent appropriately. The city of Flagstaff is fiscally responsible, and we adopted a recession plan. We had almost had this completed just before the pandemic, and we did get it adopted right about the same time of the pandemic. And this has been very helpful for an organization. It shows that we are looking forward and understanding what measures we will take as an organization in a recessionary period. There are several stages to this plan. I'm not going to go through all the details here, but I'm just trying to educate that these are one of those fiscal things we have in place. And so this plan goes through the 5 stages. And once we get to a level that we think we're going to lose 5 to 10% of our revenues in a given year, we actually seek council approval to move into a significant stage. And this then gives the city manager and organization the green light to start doing some higher level of expenditure management in our organization. These are just some of the examples of this. And we did hit that significant stage in our projections during this last pandemic. And we did go to the stage, and this was very helpful for us. And it brings us out even stronger once the recessions are done. Since then, we have removed from the recession plan altogether, and our revenues are very strong. But this is just one of those tools in our toolbox to show how we as an organization are watching and being proactive in these times. I always like to have the opportunity to explain how incredible my staff is. And our staff, finance staff, has submitted for and received the Certificate of Achievement in Excellence for Financial Reporting from the Finance Officers Association of America. This is one of the highest awards we can receive in governmental financial reporting. We've received 40 years over the time, and we've received the last 26 years of awards for our reporting, being transparent, meeting the guidelines of financial reporting and so forth. Our budget document is also an award-winning document, and we have received that for 26 consecutive years also. We also assure that we are doing procurement properly in our organization. We make sure our contracts are in place. We've done the due diligence and awarded contracts appropriately. We are part of the Achievement and Excellence in Procurement, and we've received this award for 11 consecutive years, assuring that your taxpayer funds are being spent appropriately. This chart you saw last week, I'm not going to go through it again, speaks to our fiscal strength as an organization in our bond capacity. And I know we're near 30 minutes in the meeting, and I'm going to go through this a little bit faster. It is meant to be higher level, and if you have more information or want to talk about this public safety pension funding, please reach out to me. I have other presentations. We actually have a YouTube video, which I'll share the YouTube video on why we went through pension financing for the city of Flagstaff. So please understand this is high level, mainly as education, and it doesn't affect your general obligation bonds, just demonstrating fiscal responsibility. So pension funding is related to public safety pension funding. This is our police and fire pension obligations. This graph demonstrates how our assets have not been keeping up with our liability to our public safety personnel. 2003 was the last time we were fully funded as a plan. And that's when you see the black line, which is our liability and commitments, and our green line, which are our trust assets in the plan, start to kind of separate. Liabilities start to increase faster than our assets did. The red line represents the liability that we really increased over time for our pension plans. Again, there was many contributing factors to why our pension plan and liabilities increase that I don't have time today, but we can have a side conversation, or I can point you to some presentations. But in fiscal year 2019, we started to say we've got to do something bigger, something more for this plan. And in fiscal year 20, we started to make some movements and some conversations about this liability. We've been over contributing plenty of dollars, multiple years, but not moving the needle enough. So we actually started meeting with financial advisors and public safety pension to talk about how do we address this and what's going to happen if we don't do anything. We knew that on the horizon, if we don't do something to this, we're going to be at risk for higher payments over time. So we went out and had meetings with those individuals. We brought council members along with us. Council member at the time, Odegar, was part of those conversations. And we looked at what the risk is going forward, and we got council approval to consider a pension bond. So if we did nothing at the time, we saw our contributions going up. They were currently at $10 million for the unfunded liability in 2019, but we saw future payments increasing beyond that $10 million by $200 to $2.5 million a year for the next several years. And in fact, the actuarial plan showed that our pension payments in 2036 were going to be $20 million or $10 million more per year than they are today. And that was a capacity issue we had to address. So here's a visual as far as our liability and our future pension payments. The red line represents where our future pension payments were going over time. And you can see the growth in those pension payments were going to be very difficult to manage for our organization. So we thought, let's figure out what we can do with this. The yellow dash line represents how much we were currently paying to this unfunded liability. So yes, we were paying more than required, but we weren't able to reduce this peak that was coming up. So with the restructure of the debt, the blue line represents what our new debt line is. So you can see the new blue debt line versus the red lines now is at a lower level than what we've been paying. And it actually ends in I think it's 2040 is when the actual debt payment ends, the 20-year period. So that's where we saw the advantage of doing a pension debt. As a result, we issued $131 million to pay back our obligation and to fully fund our public safety pension plans. We did this at an all-in interest rate of 2.7% on this debt. We also set aside $14 million in a reserve fund to mitigate any changes in the future that may affect an increase to our liability. So we're going to be proactive if that occurs. The present value savings, meaning the amount we're paying from our pension debt versus what the actuarial model was showing, is a $76 million difference in payments to the pension plan, saving taxpayers $76 million over the 20-year period. And as mentioned, we'll pay it off in 20 years versus the 28-year model. And this gave us a $2 million annual savings to our budget. So this decision to go out puts our plans in excess of 100% funded, which is where we should be as an organization. And it definitely strengthened our general fund, knowing we don't have those future commitments of over $10 million a year in our plans. So we received our, just going through these quickly, in December, we got our actual report was at 40% funded plans. Our interim report showed our decision had put us at 103% funded. And just recent information, we received the Public Safety Retirement Pension System post a 27%, over a 27% return on investment during that year that we gave them that over $100 million. And the timing of that was just incredible and just put our plans in even better state for the city of Flagstaff. Again, it shows those decisions greatly benefit us as a city of Flagstaff. And now we are at an average funding ratio of 107% for our plans. This is just a quick demonstration of the chart and now showing we are now actually overfunded in our plans. The green line of our assets is above our liabilities. And we have pension modelers. I don't have anything modeled yet, but we have pension modeler software that we are using to assure that we are meeting future obligations if there are market changes, if we have a 10% market decline, if they change their actual fundings, that we maintain this over 100% funded. And we are working diligently to assure we do not get back in a spread where the green line is below the black line for assets. So we've done a lot to assure that this organization is in a great financial position. And that is my last slide. Again, there's a lot more to this, and I will share some links as far as when we've given presentations if you're interested in learning more about this. But please assure that we're making the fiscal decisions for us as an organization, and gives you the assurance that when we're going to do general obligation bonds, understand we've got fiscal measures in place to assure we can meet what obligations you recommend bringing forward.
All right.
So with that, I will breathe and
ask
if there's any questions.
All right. Well, thank you, Rick, very much for the presentation. We do have a question from one of our committee members in the chat box from Mr. Ghetto. How was the 27.8% return computed? That's an outstanding return for a government to achieve.
So the public safety pension, they have more tools at their disposal to invest. So they're actually investing in stock markets and property, and they have a plethora of what they have in their toolbox versus the city of Flagstaff. We're very limited where we can invest our dollars. So they're very active. They've got a whole investment team that is looking at the spread and where they put their investments in. And remember, just before this fiscal year of 27%, is just as a recession hit prior to June 30th, and we have, from a market, we have climbed exponentially in our stock markets and those types of investments, and that's where they've come up with the returns. We can go onto the public safety pension website and look at their investment reports and what their investment is. Could they lose 28%? I won't say they can't, but the pension model is on averages. We're estimating about a 7.3% per year return is their goal over time. We've seen a 10% decline in their market values? Yes. And that's what we want to assure we're not going back to unfunded liabilities. But again, we're going to a conversation. We can definitely talk with PSPRS on their investment strategies.
Yeah, and thank you, Rick. I know, sorry about that. I know down there in Phoenix, who's in charge of that is Mr. Rick Townsend, and he was former Coconino County Deputy Manager. And I believe, in my opinion, they are in very good hands right now than they have been in the past. And so, and then was just a comment. I don't see really a question there, but thank you, Steve, for pointing that out, because yes, there's some truth to that. So, any other questions before we move on to our next agenda item? And either the chat or in the raise a hand. Thank you, Sarah, for putting that link in there that you can view more material that Rick had talked about, of maybe some videos and things like that in the future. So I guess I'm not seeing any questions. So we'll move on to the next agenda item, and then I'll have to have Sarah to help me with that. Is talking about New Point Marketing Insight and Framework. And so is New Point Marketing Team joining us today then?
New Point Marketing Team is here and ready to go.
Okay, I'll let them start. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is Steve Lynn. You see Mary Rowley, who is the engine behind New Point, and my boss. And we are adjunct help from a contract that was led by the city of Flagstaff over a year ago to work on these kinds of issues with you. Very briefly, as a background, just so that you know what we're talking about and where we come from. Between Mary and myself, we probably have more than 50 years of experience in working with municipalities on a variety of issues. I was with the city of Tucson for 13 years, and I will tell you that the presentation you just got from Rick was an exceptional presentation on municipal government and government finance, and certainly more information that we'll need to know going through our process. But all of the awards that were given to the city of Flagstaff for their work should not be taken lightly. That is a very important thing, and I know Flagstaff is in very good hands. In addition to 13 years with the city, I had my own marketing communications firm that worked with a number of municipalities for 16 years. And then for the last 13 years, I've been with Unisource Energy and Tucson Electric Power. Unisource Energy is your gas supplier in northern Arizona, and Tucson Electric Power is the utility for gas and electricity, or electricity only, in southern Arizona. And in that period of time, we've developed a number of things that we use when we work with municipalities on issues such as their overrides and budget issues. And so I want to take just a few minutes, because I know we're running late on time, to kind of set a perspective for the committee. As you know, the committee was not necessarily appointed by the mayor and council, but was authorized by the mayor and council to come into existence to really provide the mayor and council with a a recommendation that they could use as a part of their decision making when determining how many, which kind, and which areas of the projects that would be going out for public approval we would use in this bond series. Now, I know that many of you on the committee serve in other capacities with the city of Flagstaff. We have members of the Housing Commission, probably have members of the Sustainability Commission, and others who have spent many hours working on the projects that you will be seeing during the presentations. What we're asking you to do in this instance is to put those hats aside, those positions you've had on the other commissions, for the purpose of acting as really our first focus group to take a look at the entire breadth of the projects that are being submitted, and to give us some insight as to which ones you think not only are the most important, but also the ones that would be the most saleable to the public in terms of approving the packages. One of the difficulties that we have is that it takes a long time to put these packages together, but once they are assembled and once we have everything we think we need to try to bring to bear on the Flagstaff needs, we have to go to the public and get them to approve them. And so not everything has the same public appeal as something else. And so part of your job is to help the mayor and council figure out what the right balance is among the various areas that will be presented. When we have a problem or when we have a question that relates to one of the commissions that did some of the work in putting the projects together, we would like to be able to then have you switch hats, if you're a member of that commission, and share with us what your thoughts or feelings were as you put that project together. But we'll only ask you to do that when it's project specific within the area that you represent. Otherwise, everybody will be working with the same list of projects across the spectrum. And by the end of the process, you will have a full understanding of each of the projects. You will have been able to ask questions about each one. We will also help you in your decision making by providing other input from the community. Every time we meet, there'll be a call to the public, so you'll hear some things from the public. Mary and I are going to put together some survey material on perhaps more than one occasion and survey the community about their thinking about these projects. And then also we may entertain other focus groups to look at some of these projects in depth and give us some input. So with all of that information coming back through the committee, at the end of this process, your committee will put together a package of recommendations to the mayor and council that says, based on everything we know and based on all of the needs that the community has, here's the group of projects that we think has the most importance with the best chance of passing. And that's really the job of the committee. We'll help you along the way. We're here to answer technical questions about how we get from here to the ballot, how we work on ballot language, how we make things into a campaign which you won't be involved in as a committee, as a city committee, but there will be a bond support committee that takes care of the process of informing the public and advocating for the package once it's developed. And let me stop there and just see if there are any questions I could answer about any of that. Or Mary, do you want to add anything?
I was just going to say we will be primarily Steve and me at all of these meetings, so we will be going on the journey with you. We have one team member who wasn't able to be here today. Her name is Meredith Ford, so you may see her or hear from her as well. And we are here to help, and think of us for your team as a coach where you might need us too, because we've been down this road a few times. So we're here to just help any way we can and come up with the best package and get this passed. So thank you.
So Mr. Chairman, that's our presentation, and we'll take any questions if there are any, but reserve the rest of the time for you.
Okay, thank you, Mary and Stephen. Does any of the committee members have any questions for any of the New Point contractor at this time? Oh, there was a question from our vice chair, Mr. Whites, and can you maybe put your contact info for Stephen and Mary, and then for the committee members, so if they do have a question, they could reach out to you.
Absolutely. I'll put our
Absolutely.
email on
Mary
there.
will put that in the chat for you. Thanks,
Okay.
Al, for the question.
Yep, thank you. Any of other committee members might have another question for New Point at this time? I'm not seeing any, so we'll move on to our next agenda item. So the next agenda item, and I'm not sure if we're going to have time, but I'll ask the person that's going to present. It's concerning public infrastructure, public safety, and who we have with us is Fire Deputy Chief Mark Wilson. We did start a little bit late, Mr. Wilson, and as you know, we have about 15 minutes. I thought I'd give that extra 5 minutes. If you think you can get it in 15 minutes, or we can catch it the next time.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. I do think I can do it in 15 minutes. Of course, that'll be dependent upon if the questions are answered sufficiently and as we get through this process, but I intend to be able to get us through it.
Great. I'll let you start. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. So just confirming everybody can see my screen on slide 1. All right.
Yes.
So today we're going to be representing a couple teams, and in some instances multiple teams within the city, not just specifically Flagstaff Fire Department and the Police Department, but there is a collaborative need between both of those entities that we'll get into in a little bit of depth. We have deeper dives into some of the specifics for the Police Department. We also have Chief Dan Musselman that can assist us with that. So I know most of you received this, but our scope is very clear. It's to replace needed equipment that goes beyond the capacity of our available general funds. What Rick just talked about, the fiscal responsibility and the color of money, general fund is where public safety resides. And so we are dependent upon the amount of funding available for the entire city, and we're one piece of that pie that pulls from that funding source. And so within that, every year we go into a different budget process, and we have opportunities to request additional apparatus needs or equipment, safety equipment, but some of them exceed the capacity of what we're available to fund year to year. And in some instances, as we get into this, we'll talk about the fire apparatus, how that becomes even a little bit of a larger issue. So our 3 main project scopes that we want to work through are, we have a joint safety communication equipment need. We'll talk about what that entails and what those costs are related to that. We have a fire apparatus replacement need, and we also have a fire apparatus-based storage need. So each of those have independent things that go along with them, and so we'll go ahead and just start walking through these. I do think it's important to understand, though, that some of these were part of previous bonds. So it's not uncommon that some of this equipment has been part of bonds 8, 10, 12 years ago. And in the case of the fire apparatus, so that was back in the 04. So we're getting into that 18-year range is what we're talking about. And during that time, one of the things we learned was that while we still budget and we anticipate what those costs would be, as you all know, in 04, we started building a scope and a project. Well, then we started hitting some really high markets. And so cost of building, construction materials went up significantly. So when we started to do our first couple stations, we had to cut some of the intended bay space just to be able to come under the projected budget. As you all know, in 08, the budget crashed, or I should say, kind of the economy crashed. And so we were able to build a little bit more as it went through. But all of these are an important factor because they are dependent upon interoperability is really important. So I'm going to start with this public safety emergency radio equipment. So this is really designed around 2 predominant areas. One is to upgrade or replace, depending upon what is needed, and that's, we've gone through and gotten bids on that, the repeater towers on Mount Eldon. And what those do is keep the frequencies tied together for dispatch and our units, ground units in public safety, public works, into different facilities, police department and fire included into that. And then it links us into one common radio base. And so it allows for the dispatch to talk to us no matter where we're at. And so as it starts to age out, technology and infrastructure need replacing. This is one of the pieces of the puzzle that we are talking about for this radio equipment. The second piece is our actual mobile and handheld units. So when we purchased those through a bond over 10 years ago, what we also recognize is it's a piece of hardware. And there's technology that goes with it. There's an important upgrades that happen along the way. Ours is 10 years old. The replacement recommend is at 7 years. And so we've gotten 3 additional years out of this. I want to be really clear to the committee that these are still operational. These still work right now. But what we're really starting to get into is as we start to have repairs, minor or major, it's really a challenge for us to find replacement parts, and they won't be allowed to through the vendor that we use, Motorola. They will not be able to work on those because they're out of their replacement year of 7 years. And so we kind of have to piecemeal some of those things together. And one other thing is an example of technology advancement is we just received, as an example, $585,000 in a grant for new equipment for our breathing apparatus and our face piece. That's Bluetooth technology. Super important, super common. These radios don't have that capacity because they're outside of that technological age. And so we have new equipment that we cannot safely and operate as effectively on the scenes as a result of some of these aged equipment. So we've gone through and we've got the pricing through all of this. And I want to also say it includes not only fire, but it's police, it's public works, it's facilities, and streets department that all utilize these radios throughout. But the general infrastructure is around the public safety system that everybody else ties into. So the estimated cost is at 2.75. We put a 15% inflationary as we go through this whole thing because we don't know, is it going to be 1 year? Is it going to be 2 years before this funding becomes available? How we're going to be able to go about it. So I just want to be real clear. That's the number we use. We don't want to get caught short, but we certainly don't want to flex beyond what's realistic either. And we're all looking at about a 6 to 7% inflationary in the last 6 months. So our total cost of that is 3.165. As we go into the next piece of our project, it's fire apparatus replacement. I think it's important to recognize every year we work through with the fleet committee and the city and the general funding that's available. And there's an allotted amount that we work collectively with all the other divisions, including police department, streets, and many others, to replace apparatus and equipment. We've really worked comprehensively and well together because, as you can see, if you have $1 million apparatus, that eats up over 100% of the available funds on any given year. So we built an 8 to 10 year process where we replace all of these pieces of apparatus, and each division then feeds into this process. Well, these fall outside of that. These are in excess of what our capacity is for our replacement in years, age, equipment needs, and also the funding specifically. So when we look at a quint, that's this one on the lower side. That's an important piece of equipment. A quint is a fancy name for it has 5 different functions that it brings. But the biggest function that it brings outside of the all-risk engine to the right is that aerial ladder. And what that aerial ladder does is allows us to access, as we see growth within our own community for elevated residences and tighter community needs, then we have greater needs for elevated fire apparatus equipment. And so as a result, we've got a 23-year-old quint. I will say that the recommendation is all over the chart, but the national recommendation is 15 years. You replace one of these engines or quints every 15 years due to safety, technology, etc. I will say that the city of Flagstaff, we run these engines and these quints at a higher level than only one other municipality within the state runs their units more than we do on a given annual basis. So they get a lot of work. So we have a lot going on within this. And as a result, the next thing that we're looking for is an all-risk pumper. That's a $1.5 million cost for an all-risk pumper. With that inflationary, we've got one that's 21 years old. We're replacing 2 others over the last 5 years, 3 actually, over the last 5 to 7 years out in the general fund, but this is in excess of that. So what we're looking at is a 21-year-old pumper that we're asking for funding to replace that can't be covered by the general fund. Total cost 3.25. Again, 15% inflation puts us at 3.74 for those 2 pieces of apparatus. The next one that we're going to look at, and if we have questions, you can certainly ask them, but I only have like 3 more slides, and then we can go back. The next one revolves around wildfire apparatus needs. It fits into the same window that we're talking about. We've replaced some of the smaller units that we could afford within the general fund, but these fall outside of the capacity of that funding available to us. So these units are, again, over 20 plus years old. They're 21 and 22 years old. We use these units for all risk response. Now I'll pause right here and say, within each station, there's typically a minimum staffing of 3 firefighters of different capacities and ranks. So in that setting, we have multiple pieces of apparatus within that station. One crew decides which piece of apparatus is the most appropriate based on the type of call. So that's how we keep our personnel costs down, is we have these apparatus. So in a wildland setting, they would take perhaps this type 3 engine and not the type 1 all risk. A water tender brings water to the scene for non-hydrant areas and also for a wildfire response. But these units right here, we have 2 of these engines and 2 water tenders, the one on the right there that carry the water, that are both, all 4 of those are over 20 plus years old, and there's no funding currently in the general fund to cover it. So the estimated cost is $1.9 million for those 4, plus the inflationary gives us a total cost of $2.185 for the wildland side alone. The final piece of our project is apparatus-based storage. As we discussed early in this presentation, in the 04 bond process, we had to cut off of 3 stations, double bays on each one of those stations, just to make the projected cost from the front end. As a result, we now have more apparatus because one crew has to co-staff multiple, on average 3 to 4 units within a station, that we need to be able to store inside for obviously our security purposes and because of inclement weather. And so we need to build an additional 5 bays. What we're including into this proposal is that we would build these additional bays in a Butler metal building style, and that it would be on city property that's currently owned, and we would put those strategically where we need to help support the demands of those apparatus within those locations of those stations. Estimated cost is 1.2, with $180,000 being the 15% inflation, total of 1.38 for that. So when we summarize that, one of the big questions is what's the benefits and the community impacts? We don't want to become callous and say, well, that should be obvious. It's really important because we have a lot of teams that are interoperably dependent upon our ability for the radios, for the communication, for the towers, for our ability to respond locally, regionally, and beyond with our equipment, apparatus, partnerships with Forest Service when it comes to the wildfire, state fire. And it's all one big piece of the puzzle where we really see the need to replace these pieces of equipment being extremely high because we have a lot of downtime, a lot of repairs that are constantly being done. It takes a lot of our shop time, and we're in 20, 22, 24-year-old engines that we're trying to limp on without the funding to replace. It also, and the final thing, the obvious, is it allows for our equipment to be housed indoors. So the final slide project that we have is the funding. The total request of all 3 of those put together with the inflationary is $10.47 million is what we're asking for the committee to consider for us to be able to get these really critical 3 necessary pieces into the process of funding to allow us to do replacement. So with that, the final thing that each of us are going to is talk about the council goals and the objectives and how this project relates. So through the priority-based budgeting, the key community priority and objectives, this helps us meet safe and healthy community. It's a sustainable, innovative infrastructure, and it meets high-performing governance. In a regional plan concept, we've got provide a high quality of emergency response, public safety services, including all those entities we talked about. And then it allows us to maintain a high quality effectiveness and efficiency when we're dealing with newer equipment, newer apparatus, and we don't have as many breakdowns. And we can then also maintain that efficiency with the technology that's available today from a safety and a response model for the population that's being served, including all the monies available. So with that, that concludes it. I think we hit it right on the 15-minute mark. And
you did, Mr. Wilson. Congratulations. We do have some questions, but I'm going to hold those off until next week.
Okay.
To answer those questions, because I wanted to kind of keep this right at 5:05 since we did start 5 minutes late. I just want to, anybody that has members of the committee that has any questions, you know, have those ready for next week, because we'll come back to this agenda item as our first order of business next week. And then Mr. Wilson will answer those questions. Also, we'll have Chief Gaylord with us too to help with any questions. Thank you everyone for attending. I really wanted to thank Sarah Darr and Dan Musselman for help facilitating this. And I'd like to ask my Vice Chair, Mr. White, if he had any closing thoughts before we close out today. So thank you.
Just a couple. One of the Mary Rowley answering the question about New Point contacts is cut off. Her response is cut off. It says mrowley newpointmarketing.com and something else. Can you let me know what that is, or let us know what that is, Mary?
And then with that, I think we'll do is we'll have either Sarah Darr or Miss Anderson, when she gets back, get that to all the committee members with time in mind.
Well, and another point that was made back at the one of the previous meetings was that the contact information for each person on the committee would be sent to all the people on the committee. So I've yet to see that too. And I saw that, you know, like Steve Thompson had asked, I guess his contact information was listed as a different title than his name. And, you know, we should probably get that as well, just so that, you know, we have the ability to talk to each other offline at a different time between meetings.
Okay. Yeah. So very well points taken, Mr. White.
Sure.
I know Mr. Musselman and Ms. Darr will take those notes and get them so we have all that information available to us, and maybe in an email either sent out tomorrow or even on Monday, get that email list to all the committee members. So we do have a way to communicate if we have questions among our contractors or questions among ourselves. Again, you know, my goal is to keep this as transparent as possible. So all questions, everything should be answered in this, other than, you know, we're going to have some technical questions that need to be answered, but anything that helps drive a recommendation. You know, personally, I like to keep this as open and aware of anybody who's watching these or listening to these meetings will hear those conversations. So with that in mind, our next meeting will be next Thursday at same time, 4 o'clock. I ask everyone if everyone can be prompt at 4 o'clock so we have our full hour without getting past the 5 o'clock hour, especially with everyone in mind of their time and the city staff's time in mind too. So again, thank you everybody and appreciate it, and see everybody next week.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you everyone. Appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Tatter, for that great presentation.
You're